and hope that I don't run out of space. Did not get time to move all my recordings to my hard drive, my spare hard drive. So we'll see. Should be good though. Um, all right. So we've already installed PostgreSQL. That was something we did during the install fest. But there are cases in which PostgreSQL may not run well locally. For me earlier today, actually, even, I ran into an issue where I couldn't start PostgreSQL. So let's start by running a very basic Postgres. Well, let me backtrack a bit. I'm going to preface this by saying I am on a Mac, so I am using Homebrew to run my PostgreSQL commands. And when I'm saying my PostgreSQL commands, I want to be clear that right now I'm just talking about the Homebrew package itself, because we could think about PostgreSQL as existing both as a package and also a Postgres server, right? And the two are different. When we run PostgreSQL commands, pSQL commands inside of our Bash terminal, we're running commands that are in a Bash environment. This is for, let's say, running some administrative commands like setting up databases or connecting to a database or just troubleshooting the service itself. Because if we were to write brew services info or list, let's start with list. This is going to show us all the services currently running on a local machine. In my case, I've got MySQL, Nginx, and Postgres 14. Earlier today, this said error. And when it said error, it was preventing me from starting PostgreSQL. So if you run into this issue, some of the most basic things that you can do is to start by trying a simple restart. So brew services restart PostgreSQL. We know my instance is already running well. I can't exactly replicate the error unless I were to try and crash my computer, which I don't want to do. So let's just walk through this using our imaginations. So I have an error. I'm going to run restart PostgreSQL. This should work, but it may not always work. And so the next thing to try, if it doesn't work, is to manually stop and then manually start the brew services Postgres command. If that still doesn't work, there are other things you could do. Like for a more in-depth look into what's going on, we would write brew services info PostgreSQL. And what this does is it gives us more detail as to what's going on here. I have a loaded check mark as I did earlier, even when I had the error, but I had an X for running and schedulable. What I was able to infer from that is my Homebrew has no problem identifying and locating my Postgres SQL installation. So it wasn't a matter of installing or uninstalling. It's just that I wasn't able to run it. So what did I do next? Or let me actually ask, what would you do next if you were in this situation? Any ideas? No ideas at all. Oh no, that's not good. I guess one thing we could try is to look at our logs, which is probably going to be one of the most common things to do when you're in a situation where you don't know what to do next. And if we remember from week 1 of the curriculum, we learned to use tail. In this case, we're going to be running tail to see the final lines of our Postgres log. Now, one of the tricky parts about this is your installation folder may differ from this, especially if you're on a different operating system and if you're installing a different version of if you're on a different version of the operating system or you're installing a different version of that package or service or whatever, all of these things can affect and impact where your logs and your services are going to be installed. So this is one of the things that makes troubleshooting across various environments a little tricky. But you could try these 2 common install paths. In my case, I have Postgres logs inside of, well, I thought I did. Let's go into this directory and see. Typo, not really a typo, but because I'm using PostgreSQL version 14, my log file is called PostgreSQL add 14.log. So if I were to tail this, I get some results. Right now, it's not going to tell me any errors because I'm not experiencing any errors. But earlier today, it was telling me that I had this fatal error. Log file postmaster.id, PID already exists. Has anyone here ran into this issue before? Okay, good. It's not a fun issue, but it's not a tricky issue either. This usually happens when you have an instance of Postgres that doesn't close properly. Because what this log file is, it's basically a built-in mechanism for Postgres to prevent another instance of Postgres running if one already exists. So whenever you start PostgreSQL, it will create this file. Whenever you successfully shut down PostgreSQL, it will delete this file. But if you reboot your computer, for example, in the middle of running a Postgres SQL server without closing it down, it might not shut down properly, especially if you're in the middle of some kind of like long execution that's taking a while to complete. Or maybe you are in the middle of that long execution and your computer freezes. These are common scenarios where this might happen. So if it does happen, one thing you can do is to remove that postmaster.pid. Will you lose any data? You might. So this might be something that you'll want to treat as a last resort kind of thing. But if you're otherwise certain that you don't have any active instances of Postgres running or that none should be running, you should be okay to delete it. So with that, we run delete and then we call brew services restart with -vvv PostgreSQL. What is -v? It's a flag that will tell brew to return some logging detail. So it basically stands for verbosity. And you could stack this command. So the more V's you pass in, the more verbose the logs. The other option, if you still are experiencing issues running Postgres locally, is to just containerize it. And we have several examples where we do that. So that's one of the reasons we introduced Docker early on in this curriculum. And it's another reason why we continue to use Docker for Postgres database exercises. It's just cleaner this way. You spin up a container, Now, I guess one thing I do want to point out is if you need that data to persist, you're going to want to migrate and export that data or ensure that it's stored in a volume properly, right? One thing that we commonly do is we write our shell scripts to spin up a Docker container that will also immediately remove everything when you turn it off. And if this happens, your data is not going to persist. You're going to lose all of your data. So just be mindful of what exercises you're running on as you're going through these challenges, take some time to read through the Docker file, the shell script, the Docker Compose, whatever is being used by the repository or the project to get a better understanding on what's actually happening behind the scenes. Let's see. With that, I think the rest of this should be very familiar if you have taken either the daytime or evening and weekend full stack curriculum. We have some very basic PostgreSQL commands here. This is really like the foundation of navigating various databases, right? You'll need to know to pass in host names, usernames, and database names in order to navigate various databases, very likely on various hosts once you're in a work environment, because if you're in a largish company or even a decent sized company, you're going to have databases that belong to separate teams, separate services that will be on separate hosts. And this is an instance where you're going to need to use these kind of commands to specify where you want to go. For the rest of our time here in the curriculum, we may not be using some of this as much, like host name, maybe not even username, but you'll probably be playing around with various databases. So we'll, at the very least, be using this. Okay. Oh, something that you might not use, but you might, or at least let's just introduce you to it so you know what it is. This -W is used to explicitly prompt for a user password. So even if you have your password stored in an environment variable or some kind of password file, you can use this to force prompt for a password. Why you would want to do this? It's more secure. Maybe you're in a group project with a team member who has a habit of dropping databases. Who knows? All right, let's switch over to terminal commands because we've so far talked about bash commands. Once you've connected to a PostgreSQL database, so let's see, what databases do I have? Well, if I type PSQL, I could hop into a terminal and I can use \L to list all of my databases. The commands that I think you should maybe memorize first are simple help commands, and there are two of them. What is the difference between these two? \help will give us all of these loud commands that are just yelling at us in all caps. These are basically your universal SQL commands. Are they universal to every single SQL language? I don't know. I don't know all languages, but we can safely say that these are the fundamentals of CRUDing a basic SQL system, right? So creating, reading, updating, and deleting. These are common commands that you'll find across various PostgreSQL or SQL systems. The \?, this is specifically for PostgreSQL commands. So these are meta commands that are run by PostgreSQL, let's say the package, but not necessarily sent to the PostgreSQL server. So we're not actually manipulating any tables. Now, some of these commands do give us details on tables and whatnot. So it is CRUDing in some way because it's reading from the database. But for the most part, these are going to be used to help you regain your bearings, to help you navigate the database where you are and to just retrieve information that you might need, like information on users and user permissions, right? If you run into some kind of conflict where you're not able to access a database, it'd be good to use one of these commands to check for proper user roles and permissions. So with that, we can talk about some more specific meta commands. \C, for example, is to connect to a specific database. When you go into PostgreSQL by default, without passing in anything specific, you're going to go into your default database, which, unless you specify otherwise, is probably going to be named after your username. So let's try going into a different database. Is this a database? I don't know. Let me double check what I have. Dummy underscore D DB. So let's do \c dummy DB. And now I am connected to dummy DB as user GDCB. I'm going to go back to my main database with \c, and I'm going to, I think all of these databases are empty. Nope, let's go into the cars DB. That might have something. So let's see if D table name, well, let's just do L for now to list what's in here. Or I should say, whoops, DT for tables. So we see that we have 5 tables: advertisement, app user, car model. If I want to learn about any of these tables more specifically, I could do a \D and the table name. So whereas I originally did DT to get details on all my tables, I can do D in the table name to get details on a specific table. And this tells me that my car table has these columns with these data types and whether or not they are nullable, which means that they accept or don't accept null values. So there's also a lot of other info, which we're not going to dive into so much right now. And let's not worry about these either. We're not going to talk about schemas, views, or functions just yet. You'll be covering schemas at the end of the week with Chandra going through some schema design exercises, which should also still be somewhat familiar to the full stack folks. I know for sure it's in the evening and weekend program. Not so sure if it's in the daytime program. That said, I think that's, oh no, we got a few more, I guess. So we'll dive into these in more detail tomorrow during the SQL queries exercise, but we have basic, the most basic command that you're going to want to memorize is select, right? It allows you to read from databases. So in this case, let's see if we could read from the cars. Is it cars plural or car singular? Car singular. So our star symbol is a wildcard, if you remember from week 1, which allows us to select everything from this table. But we don't want everything, right? Because if, let's say, our table was really, really, really big, it's going to return a lot of information that is going to take a while to sift through. So instead of doing everything, we'll do everything but limited to 10, the first 10 results. So I forgot my from keyword, and it doesn't like the comma because I don't need a comma. I should delete that from the example. And it looks like I've got some cars actually. And as we see, it limited to 10 results. Cool. We'll also want to just understand that create and drop are probably going to be the next most used commands that you'll memorize. These you can use from within a database. So like, let's say if I wanted to create a new database, call it cars2, and then we do our \L. We now see, oh, it did not make it.
It was the semicolon.
Nice.
I do it all the time.
Nice catch. Thank you. I still do that all the time too. I should add that to the lesson, actually. That's a very good call out. Thanks, Phil. So very, very important in PostgreSQL. You want to end your statements. You want to explicitly end your statements with the semicolon. So now that we've done that, we could do our \L, and we see we have a cars2 database. It's very common if you forget to use a semicolon to start writing a command and then you're not getting the results you want. So you start writing more commands, and next thing you know, you're going to have a lot of stuff happening that might not do what you ultimately want to do or just error out. So you'll get in the habit eventually of using the semicolon, but it's still very easy to forget. All right, let's get out of this database. We're going to use our keyboard shortcut Control D, which is more powerful than Control C to get out. And now we have another way of locating all of our databases, \L. So just like we saw from within the terminal, we could see all of the databases from outside of the terminal in our bash environment. Now, what's the second command? If I run this, we're going to get the exact same results. So what exactly is the difference? You could probably infer from this being familiar that it is a command that was run inside the terminal. So from there, you could probably deduce that our -C flag stands for command. This means that you can use terminal commands from outside of a terminal, basically. So if I were to say -C, create database, let's call it cars3, and let's not forget our semicolon this time. Let's see if that was created. Let's do a psql -c \L, and it looks like we've got a cars3. Any questions? Cool. All right, let's switch over to databases and CSVs, which don't mind the date. This is an old slide deck, but we are going to talk about databases and CSVs. So what is a database? It is an organized collection of structured information. Oh no, it's doing that thing. I think it's got animation set, so just have to remember to double click next. It is often controlled through a database management system, and an example of this would be PostgreSQL. So they are commonly modeled to contain tabular data, so basically data that exists in rows and columns. And as you should already know, when we use CSV editors or spreadsheet editors, they also render that data in rows and columns. But CSVs themselves are a lot simpler. You can open up a CSV file inside a text editor because it's nothing but a list of comma separated values. How that's rendered into a table with rows and columns is going to require something like Excel or Google Sheets. But one of the benefits of CSVs is that it's such a simple format. It's easy to share across many, many different kinds of readers. What else? So data, basically, you've heard this term a lot by now, CRUD, create, read, update, delete. These are the basic functions that are applied to data inside of a structured query language and CSVs. So some common management systems. We definitely talked about PostgreSQL, but there's also MySQL, MongoDB, Redis, Oracle DB, Snowflake. What you use wherever you land is going to vary from organization to organization, and sometimes it's going to be more than one thing. At Innova, across the various teams, we use PostgreSQL, MongoDB, Redis, Oracle, and Snowflake. So databases versus CSVs. One way to think about this is that databases are essentially dynamic systems for containing data in multiple structures, whereas CSV is more static, and it's useful for containing data as a single file. So in terms of a relationship, you could think of CSV as being a very simplified database. What does CSV stand for? I've already said it, comma-separated values, and it really is just comma-separated values. That's how simple of a format this is. So let's think about the keyword delimited, right? It's a delimited data format, which means there is a boundary specific sequence. And really, this is just a fancy way of saying we are able to separate the data in this with a delimiter. And in our case, in the case of a CSV, the delimiter is the comma. Again, it's tabular data, just like in a database. And its simplicity is what makes it very accessible and easy to use, both by humans and applications. Fast and easy to read and write with. It's super easy to like just run a JavaScript or Python file to manipulate data in between JSON to CSV. It's very handy for transforming data in between environments, right? Like data that you get from an API that you're manipulating, let's say inside a front-end application, or you're passing it to the back end, or you're just manipulating from the command line. It's super simple and easy to use because of its simplistic nature. It's memory efficient and compact as a result as well. A little bit of history on this is it has existed since before the first personal computer even came out. Some other like I guess geekier history that I definitely didn't have memorized. IBM Fortran compiler designed in 1972 used this format before freeform input-output was even defined in 1978. A standard was proposed in 2005, which I think is interesting. And even though a standard was proposed, it's not necessarily followed, right? You'll find that across various applications and readers that how a CSV is interpreted, even across various operating systems, it may not be the same. One program might read a space, a white space inside your CSV differently from another program. But standards were proposed anyway, and I guess in a way to compensate for the lack of an ability to force these standards, the World Wide Web Consortium Working Group released documentation for these recommended standards on the web in 2016. Okay, so some of the RFC standards that we should be following if we want to be good developers. We know that these are delimited data types, so we definitely want to have some kind of a delimiter, in this case, a comma. Records and rows are going to be terminated by new lines, so another kind of delimiter. If we don't have this second delimiter, then we're not going to be able to have multiple rows. We'll only have columns. So we'll also want to follow standards on specific character encoding. The terminator format is not necessarily required. So how the end of the file is read may be different. You might have already seen this on GitHub, right? What a terminator is. You might have seen on GitHub by now that at the end of a file, you see that circle with a red minus sign that basically says your file is not exited properly because you're missing a new line. That's a terminator. And some applications or platforms even like GitHub are very particular about this. Fields with embedded line breaks must be quoted so as to be distinctly recognized by software. Leading and trailing spaces and tabs are considered as part of the field, so they must not be ignored. By following these standards, we get as much consistency as possible in between different applications. But you're going to find as an engineer and developer that may not necessarily be working on your own CSV application or functionality, but utilizing pre-existing ones, that there will be variations in how a program manipulates this data. common use cases for CSV, because it's such a common data type. It's probably going to be used by a lot of different less tech savvy teams, and you as a tech person in a tech team will have to live with this. Not that it's such a bad thing, because CSVs really are a very flexible data type or data format. So some common CSV conflicts. We see here that we have white spaces. We have white spaces inside of quotations. We have white spaces before and after commas. These are going to be interpreted differently across different applications. We even see, right, a comma inside quotations is going to be treated differently from a comma outside of those quotations. We also know that not all implementations will support embedded line breaks. So if you were to see this in your text editor, it could very well be read as, like, let's say the front end as being all in a single line. So yes, like in this example as well, if we use a specific new line character, this might force the application to recognize the new line, but there are cases where it might not. And in this case, let's pretend this was a front end, a very ugly and crude front end, but a front end nonetheless. You try to use /n to create a new line, and you find that it doesn't work. And so a customer who's not tech savvy reads this, and they are confused as to what they're seeing. All right, these are just some common CSV conflicts to be mindful of when working with CSVs. When headers are optional, this may cause errors in an application that either requires them or does not require them. Case in point, this quarter and last quarter, actually, one of my projects was creating a new front-end application for our customer service reps and some business folks that basically allow them to submit requests for batch automations, right? And surprise, surprise, this is done through CSVs. Now, some people will submit CSVs with the headers, and some people will not. And how your application handles these differences, you're probably going to want to implement some way of doing that. So in our case, for example, the application that we built out, it had to first interpret whether headers were being read or whether they were being passed in at all, right? Because if it's expecting headers, but headers are not passed in, it's going to treat that first row of data as headers. So you're going to have to find some kind of way, maybe like a conditional of some sort, right? To handle these as two separate cases. What else is common? Yeah, I think that's actually it. That's the end of the slide deck. Yeah, these are just some common things to be mindful of when working with CSVs. There's a challenge specifically on converting JSON to CSVs, as well as what other challenge is there? I'm blanking on the other ones. Let me pull up GitHub and let's go over to week 3, day 1. We've got the word guest CSV challenge. That's our other challenge today, which I think should be familiar to evening and weekend folks and possibly daytime full stack folks as well. So JSON and CSV is the new one. Take a stab at both, and we will reconvene at 9 o'clock. Oh, go ahead, take a break since we've been sitting here for like a good 45 minutes already, and I'll see you later at 9.